Everybody sit down, take the seats. My name is Troy Duster, and I'll be moderating this session. We're being filmed and webcast, so I'll ask everyone to please turn off your cell phones. In a few moments, I'll have a little bit more to say about providing some context for this session, but I want to begin by introducing a heroic dean of the law school who's here in spite of the fact that he's going through some healing process after some surgery. So Chris Edley, the dean.
Thanks very much, Troy. And listen, it's really an honor to have been asked to give you a brief welcome. The topic is so important, and my admiration for the organizers, in particular Troy and Sue Schweik. I can't say enough about how important this venture is, and how the law school is grateful for having been given the opportunity to host. Right upstairs from here, and also I want to apologize, I had shoulder joint replacement surgery a couple of weeks ago, and I'm in a constant state of pain, but I do have great drugs, but I'm a little bit loopy, and so I know this is being taped, but I just wanted to.
Which drugs?
I just wanted to get my excuses on the record. Upstairs, if you haven't seen them already, please take the time to go upstairs, up this set of stairs, and make a left, and it will be impossible to miss 4 paintings by the iconic contemporary artist Fernando Botero from his Abu Ghraib series, which was shown on the Berkeley campus a few years ago, and which Botero subsequently donated to the Berkeley Art Museum, a hugely valuable gift. And we prevailed upon the Berkeley Art Museum to let us display 4 of these magnificent works at the law school. The reason I did that is that with my warped perceptions as a lawyer, when I look at this art, what I see is human nature without the constraints, without the civilizing constraints of the rule of law. What I see is a depiction of the abuses of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, made powerful and provocative as a reminder to us that human nature so frequently disappoints. And so much of the social construction that we do through law, through politics, is about constraining, confining the devils within us, perhaps even more than it is about elevating the angels within us. So I thought it would be particularly appropriate for a school of law, a world-leading school of law, to ask the question, what can art teach us about the responsibility of law? Thus the paintings, and thus the special honor for us in hosting this kind of conference. What happens when law is not there? What happens when law is itself constructed on the basis of a failed or incomplete morality? The second thing I wanted to say to you is a little bit in the nature of a war story. When I was working in the Clinton White House in his first term, most of my time was spent as an official at the Office of Management and Budget. But I spent the last 8 months or so of it before I returned to Harvard to continue doing something about the footnote deficit that afflicts Western civilization. Has it been worrying you too? Yeah. The president asked me to stick around and conduct a thorough government-wide review of affirmative action. Because affirmative action programs were in the crosshairs of the Republicans on Capitol Hill, and Clinton was trying to figure out what to do with the programs, what he thought about these programs. So, of course, being a professor, I took the opportunity to convert this not into just a survey of what the programs were, but into a deep exercise with the president and vice president, consisting of multiple seminars with them over a period of 6 months, exploring the values at stake in the debates about race and gender and disability, etc. And it was just a fabulous experience. I wrote a book, read my book, I Need the Cash. But one of the aspects, that one thing particularly stands out to me, and that was an exchange that I had, particularly with the vice president in particular, in which I was throwing out a hypothetical drawn from a Title VII case in New Jersey, the Piscataway case. It was about sort of a reverse discrimination case involving teachers. And I presented these facts, and I was pressing the president and the vice president about how they would handle this and what they thought was right and how should we think about race. And Gore was absolutely definitive and quick in his answer. And I said, well, why? And he started to explain, and it was a pretty goofy answer. And I said, well, why? And he gave some more goofy responses. And I said, but why do you think that? And he stopped and said, I have to think about it. So a couple of weeks later, he said to me, you know, I've been thinking about that, and I think I came up with the answer. I think this has to do with the way I was raised as a Southern Baptist. And I said, why? That's the Socratic method, right? Yeah, why? And he said, well, I think that these things, these issues about race and difference, to me, it's like sin. And what I believe is that within all of us, there is the capacity, if not the proclivity, to sin. And it is not something that we instruct against one day, and one is forever inoculated against sinfulness. Rather, it is something it's in our nature, this capacity to sin, and we have to be committed to struggle against it every day. You don't give up. You struggle against it every day. And prejudice and bias, hatred of the other, fear of difference is like that. It's like a snake, his words, snake coiled within our breasts. And circumstances can just trigger that snake to lash out and produce horrific consequences. Genocide, eugenics, bigotry. I think it's in our nature. But like sin, I don't think that means we should give up. I think that means we have to be prepared to struggle against it every day. Now, I raised that example not only because I thought it was a remarkably insightful and useful insight that Gore had, that he invented, actually, same day he invented the internet, a remarkably insightful comment, but because I think it reminds us that things like eugenics, the ugliest manifestation of this human capacity to fear and even hate, are not just incidents of history. They are continuing challenges of character, of social cohesion, of human purpose. Continuing challenges, and if we don't study them, if we don't work at understanding them, then we simply will not be good at combating them, and that task of combating them is with us day in and day out. What can we learn from eugenics about the other struggles for justice that we find stalled and opposed on the basis of fear of difference? So the topic of this conference is very timely. It's not simply about ripping off the bandages or dusting off the books or facing history. It's about facing who we continue to be and understanding not simply what the product of, forgive me, a diseased political consciousness produced, but also studying what was not done by people on the sidelines. Why the opposition was unsuccessful in such important respects, and what we can learn about that for those of us who are committed to opposing injustice today and tomorrow. So that's enough from me. I just wanted to make the case, in case any of you were in doubt, that what you're talking about here is important. It is really important. And I hope that as you struggle to both understand this topic, you'll also do some thinking about the transferability of your insights to other contexts, because that transportability is the way you build alliances. And without alliances, we really are not going to make progress. I'll stop there and turn it back over to Troy. Well, just one last thing. I want to say that as I read over the list of participants and looked at some of the bios, I was thrilled by the multidisciplinary conceptualization of the topic. This is very much a theme here at our law school, that the most important and difficult challenges facing our society demand the attention from multiple disciplines and professions harnessed together. And I can think of, I've seen few examples in my 8 years here of how powerfully important that is than in this assembly of minds and hearts. Good luck with the rest of your day, and again, thank you for the invitation.
For those who came in late, I wanted to just reiterate, we're being both webcast and filmed. So if you could please turn off your cell phones, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Let me try to provide just a short context for this session. 9 years ago, then Governor of California, Gray Davis, issued an apology, an official apology from the state to those who had been the victims of forced sterilizations in California. But that was the end of the story. Nothing came of it. Indeed, I had lunch with a colleague, a historian, American history, 19th century, a few weeks ago in this preparation for this conference, and he asked about what was going on with this conference. I told him. He knew a little bit about eugenic history, but he was shocked to learn that California had been the leaders. Indeed, 20,000 of the 60,000 sterilizations had occurred in the state. And he was even more shocked when I told him that California was the model for Nazi Germany's enforced sterilization program in the 1930s. Now, that history is very rarely repeated in this country, so with that kind of a provocative statement, you need references, and being academic and having University of Texas, among other classrooms watching this webcast, I thought I'd better add some references. Number one, Phil Riley wrote a book many years ago summarizing the whole country's history of enforced sterilizations. Number two, Dan Kevlar's sort of classic overview of eugenics touches upon the topic. But number three, and probably most important for this discussion about the role of California internationally, is Stefan Kuhl's classic work called The Nazi Connection: Eugenics, American Racism, and German National Socialism. Then a few years later, after Gray Davis's apology, North Carolina officially acknowledged its role in forced sterilizations, not only apologized, but introduced a bill in the legislature to provide $50,000 per person to victims who had been the subjects of forced sterilizations into the 1970s. Unfortunately, earlier this year, that bill did not pass. At least the allocation of resources was gutted from the bill. But it does tell you that there is an engaged conversation about this topic in many parts of the nation. North Carolina, one of many states that have begun to acknowledge that past. Now we're going to hear from 4 different presenters to link these issues, continuities, to place the California experience at the center of this legacy. You know from the title, raise questions about whether current practices have a direct link to the past. So the title of the session, Legacy of the Past, Eugenics, is a question mark. We'll now hear from presenters who are going to deal with this matter. Each presenter will have about 12 minutes, and to make certain that we have time for audience participation at the end, I've informed each speaker that I will be the mean enforcer of the rule. Finally, because the information about each speaker biographically is in your program, I'm going to dispense with lengthy introductions to save time. So to begin, we'll hear from Alexander Stern, University of Michigan, and Miroslava Chavez Garcia, UC Davis, providing an overview of eugenic sterilization in California. How do you get out of here? You got it.
Okay. Good midday to everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. One of the things that's very important when thinking about sterilization, forced sterilization in California and eugenics, is to put California in the broader international international context. So looking across the 20th century, there have been programs that have been directly eugenic or neo-eugenic in origin and policies that have been carried out in a wide variety of places in which hundreds of thousands of people have been forcibly sterilized. So for example, in the 1990s, under the government of Fujimori in Peru, over 400,000 indigenous women were forcibly sterilized under a population control program. That's similar to the number of people sterilized under the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. In Sweden, in the first half of the 20th century, about 40,000 people were sterilized under that nation's eugenics program. In Canada, to the north of us, about 3,000 in 2 provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, that passed sterilization laws. And then putting the United States in perspective, about 65,000 sterilizations occurred from 1907 to the 1970s under state eugenics laws that were passed during that time period in 33 different states. California was at the forefront of the eugenics movement in the United States, not just in terms of forced sterilization, in terms of other aspects of eugenics, eugenic racism, anti-immigration campaigns, and also with real links to the early environmental and conservation movement. California passed the third sterilization law in the nation in 1909, and one of the notable things about California's sterilization law is that it was modified and it was changed, but it was never overturned, revoked, or fully repealed until 1979. So in other words, it was on the books for 70 years. In that period of 70 years, over 20,000 sterilizations were performed in 11 different state institutions, two kinds of institutions, what were called insane asylums or psychiatric homes. The terminology changes over time, and about 8,000 in homes for the feeble-minded or morons. Many of the people sterilized were people we would today classify as people with developmental disabilities. The majority of these sterilizations occurred between 1922 and 1953. This graph throws into relief the prominence of California in terms of eugenic sterilizations. Note, this goes up to 1935. After that time period, some states had higher proportions or, ratios per person of sterilizations, like North Carolina or Virginia, but this gives you a sense of California being the leader of the pack in terms of eugenic sterilization. What I have here is, as California was proud of its eugenic sterilization program. So the state department that was in charge of the institutions and really kind of implementing the sterilization program, the Department of Institutions, published annually reports which had yearly and cumulative numbers of sterilizations. So just looking at this report from 1941, if you look at the cumulative totals, you can see that almost 15,000 people had been sterilized in the institutions that are listed there. What are some of the general patterns of sterilization, eugenic sterilization in California? Well, it peaked in 1939 and 1941 with over 800 sterilizations in these institutions I mentioned. The law was modified, and there was a pretty dramatic decline in sterilizations performed after 1953, although it's very important to note that they did continue into the 60s and 70s. Over time, we see a pattern where initially more men were sterilized than women, but by the 40s and 50s, more women were being sterilized. That was in keeping with the shift from more sterilizations, initially more performed in psychiatric homes and later more performed in homes for the, quote, feeble-minded. Over time, these sterilizations focused more explicitly on parenting skills than on hereditary worth, and increasingly they focused on population control and family planning. This slide here, this graph, shows this shift in gender that I talked about, with blue being male and red being female. So you can see over time, although the numbers are decreasing, into the 40s and 50s, more women are being sterilized. Some more general patterns of sterilization. A variety of sources show that foreign-born white ethnic immigrants were sterilized at disproportionate rates, in other words, Italians, Portuguese. Various research, including by Miroslava, myself, and Natalie Lira, is showing that Mexican origin or Spanish surnamed individuals were disproportionately sterilized in California state institutions. So, for example, between 1937 and 1948, 26% of the sterilizations performed at an institution called Pacific Colony were Spanish surnamed individuals. Similar disproportionate rates with African Americans, and we note many of those sterilized today are those, as I mentioned, that would be categorized with developmental disabilities. So there's a strong, very strong thread in terms of disability history here. And another important thing to note about eugenic sterilization, while the language was about hereditary worth and about stopping the propagation of bad genes in the gene pool, sterilization was also about social control, and it was about sexual control. So there was a strong element about controlling promiscuity among kind of, girls gone bad, so to speak, and also there was an element in terms of controlling male sexuality, particularly men identified as sodomites or sexual deviants. And I'll leave you with, at the end of my brief presentation, with a sterilization order. Please move the camera away. This is taken from a microfilm at the department, what is now the Department of Mental Hygiene. 15,000 of these sterilization orders were generated in California at these different institutions. And this is the bureaucratic pro forma document that went along with these 20,000 sterilizations. So in them you can see that, basic information was given, a diagnosis and rationale and so on. One of the things that you're probably wondering is, who were these people that were sterilized? What were their stories, and what more can we learn about them as human beings? And I'll turn it over to Miroslava to talk about those issues.
As Alex noted, it's really important to understand beyond the facts and figures to understand some of these human stories that we're talking about. So I'll give you a few examples today. So these were individuals who were categorized as unfit, and so the question becomes, who were these individuals? How were they categorized? And one of the ways that one group that was identified as unfit were those identified as feeble-minded, and those who believed to not have the capacity to develop beyond a 12-year-old child. It was one category. Another were those identified as the insane or the diseased. Also those identified as sexual perverts, homosexuality or engaging in sexuality outside of marriage. Also those suffering from some form of a deformity or a disability. These were the categories. And they were believed to carry dysgenic traits which then would be passed on to future generations. And so the idea behind sterilization is a way to sort of clean the body politic and to ensure the legitimacy of the future generations. A classification system they used to identify the so-called defectives were they used different forms to sort of identify them, and one was through IQ tests. They also looked at behavior, kind of things that these individuals did, and that would identify them. Also, they looked at what they believed to be were physical markers, or sort of the stigmata, particularly of the feeble-minded. So one of the examples is they looked at widely spaced teeth as one sort of characteristic of these. So they had a laundry list of these things that they used. They also used social case histories where they would interview individuals. Social workers would interview individuals and their families and look at inheritance patterns. And one of the things that they used was a very powerful tool were these family trees that they would look at over the course of 3 generations and identify these traits across family lines and try to figure out how these were inherited. So these became very powerful in making their scientific arguments. In my own research, and as Alex mentioned, we know that ethnic and racial minorities were disproportionately identified. In my work on youth and looking at California youth between 1921 and 1940, I found that 25% of youth who were sterilized were youth of color, again, which is disproportionate to their numbers. And this young boy was identified as defective, and his siblings as well, but he was not sterilized. But this is just an example. The primary place that they were sterilized, over 4,000 were sterilized in California, Sonoma State Hospital, under the direction of the medical superintendent, Fred Butler. And I argue that he was very aggressive, and he was a leader in this program. And he advocated across the country. And looking at these human stories, what's also very powerful to look at is that they challenge the state's effort to sterilize their loved ones, and even though the state used consent forms, which is really empty bureaucratic procedure, as my colleague has argued, and so even though they had these forms, the state could still go over their head and sterilize. Even though they didn't get the patient's parents to sign it or their guardians, they could still go over their head and sterilize them. And this is a really good example of the state's rationale for sterilizing individuals. And in this case, it's about, Fred Butler's talking about a boy whose family is from Mexico. So it says here the boy's mother is a native of Mexico, his father is dead. They come from a racial stock of Mexicans and Indians. We have written to the mother regarding sterilization, have received 3 refusals. However, we feel that the refusals were due to ignorance of the importance of such an operation. And owing to the fact that he's an IQ 53, we feel he should have the operation, especially given his criminal tendencies. We therefore request your approval over and beyond the 3 refusals from the mother. So this is the process. You see this repeatedly in the records. We know that Mexican-American parents, in my own research, have shown that disproportionately they actually resisted. They put a lot of resistance to this efforts to sterilize them, and they turned to different places for support. They would turn to the Catholic Church in Los Angeles, particularly where I was looking at, the Mexican consulate, and also the state courts. And actually in the 1930s, Sara Rosas Garcia, who was the mother of a 19-year-old daughter who was going to be sterilized, brought a lawsuit against the Department of Institutions. It was the case at the lower level court was denied. She lost that case, and she appealed to the appellate court. Eventually, she lost on a technicality, but there was a justice who dissented, and it was really important, I thought, in bringing out this, what he said in this case. He said that that the power that the Department of Institutions had, the law, violated the process of law, and he noted it was clothed with absolute unrestricted power to sterilize. And this plenary power that the Department of Institution had, he noted in his decision, violated, was at the essence of slavery. and as well, excuse me, one more line, outrageous constitutional guarantees. So in conclusion, we wanted to note as well is that Mexican-American families had a role in the future of the repeal of the law, which was repealed in 1979. Families worked with our Torres assemblyman in Los Angeles to overturn sterilization. So, thank you.
The presentations will be approximately 12 minutes. If you know you have to leave in the next 12 minutes, please leave now. It is quite rude to leave in the middle of a presentation. Thank you. Next, we'll have a presentation from filmmakers, Renee Tajima-Pena, UC Santa Cruz, Virginia Espino at UCLA, and Kate Trumbull, the filmmaker. The subject is the history of Mexican-American women who alleged they were forcibly sterilized in the 1970s. So this is the attempt to draw the links and the legacy of the past to the present.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate being invited here. I'm Virginia Espino. I'm actually an oral historian. I work at the Center for Oral History at UCLA. And I'm going to just talk a bit about the 1970s sterilizations that occurred at the LA County Hospital in Los Angeles. How many of you are familiar with the case Madrigal v. Killigan? So I'll tell you a little bit about that lawsuit. It was brought by Mexican women, Mexican origin women, against the LA County Hospital for sterilizations that they viewed were coercive, unwanted, and sometimes they weren't even aware that they had been taking place. So the film that we are going to present a few minutes of looks at that case. It looks at the women involved, it looks at the plaintiffs. So there are a lot of heroes in this story, and that's what the beauty of being able to tell a story that is not too far in the distant past is you can actually talk to people who were there, and they can speak for themselves. They can tell you what it was like for them. And the genesis of this film came from my research, working on my dissertation, as well as the work of Elena Gutierrez, who's here, I think in the audience, wrote a book on the subject. So these two products of academic work form the basis of this film, and Renee is now going to talk about how do you turn that academic work, how do you turn something that has a lot of archival research and interviews and documentation into a documentary.
I'm actually just going to introduce the film, and again, as a filmmaker, it was very important for me to draw from this very seminal work of Elena Gutierrez and the histories of not only research by Virginia, but also Alexandra Stern, who's written about the case. And so, again, as a filmmaker, I want to, from the ground level, look at the perspectives of the people who actually lived these experiences in the maternity ward at LA County Hospital, not only the mothers, but also the doctors, as well as the key players surrounding this legal case. And I hope that that perspective from the ground up really broadens, not only broadens, but also complicates our understanding of what went on there. So we're going to show you a clip that is primarily, or all, consisting of interviews with the mothers. There is a multiplicity of voices in the final film, but we only had a few minutes, so this is just the mothers. The two cameras, if you can turn off your audio and
So that was a 3.5-minute rough cut sample. We are currently editing the film, and I apologize for the sound. It should have been loud. I don't think we could get the speakers up loud enough. So the film Mas Bebés will be on PBS next year, but it will also be the centerpiece for an 18-month or 2-year public and community engagement campaign that we plan to coincide with civic awareness and educational campaigns that are currently being mounted by other reproductive justice organizations and folks who are working around the issues of coercive and forced sterilization. Our campaign is inspired by the reproductive justice movement, who insist that the notion of choice is meaningless without considering the intersectionality of race, class, and immigration status, access to political power, and that despite the advancements in women's rights, the needs of poor immigrant and women of color continue to be marginalized and neglected today. Our goals in this campaign are to, one, link the Madrigal case to the legacy of eugenics and in history and in today, to create online and offline venues for audiences of the film and campaign to connect to social action, first-person testimony, and short videos and tools that we'll create. And 3, to embark on a digital storytelling campaign that I'll talk about in a moment. We are also working in partnership with the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center and Library, which houses the premier collection of primary research on the case. And we'll be creating a digital archive in a creative way, sort of not a text-based archive, but something that's where students and educators can explore the documents of the case and also connect to the other issues, stories and issues in a digital archive way. And then we are also, as I mentioned, embarking on a storytelling campaign that we plan to organize with the collaboration of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health and California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. And we're currently searching for other organizational partners in order to address, the personal stories of coercive sterilization and issues of reproductive justice. Is there anything else?
I just want to add one point that I forgot. Just one quick point, just for chronology's sake, that Alex and Mitos talked about the period of eugenics focusing on population control and family planning, and that's what we would consider these sterilizations to go under that period in the 70s, when it wasn't a state-sponsored program, but it was under the guise of family planning that these sterilizations took place and were funded by the federal government. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were given probably index cards, white index cards, and if you have questions you'd like to have addressed, please just make a notation on those cards and we'll collect them at the end of the next 2 presentations. On the theme of continuities, links, legacies to the past, we now turn to what is happening in California's prison system. And for that, we'll hear from Kimberly Jeffrey and Courtney Hooks from Justice Now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to be here today. So my name is Courtney Hooks. I'm the Campaign and Communications Director for Justice Now. I am from a community, majority Black and Latino, that has been targeted for policing and imprisonment. I've never been locked up myself. So I'm here representing Justice Now, and we are a legal and human rights organization based in Oakland, California. We believe that policing and prisons do not make our communities safer, but rather that policing and prisons' original intent and actual lived real impact is about containing us, fragmenting us, killing us. So it's not a broken system, it's a system that is doing its job and doing its job really well. So our goal, our focus is to partner with people inside women's prisons in California to challenge prisons and challenge all the systems that enable prisons to exist in order to build a safe and compassionate world without prisons. We partner with people on communications and policy campaigns that do all of these things. We support and train people inside on human rights law through the participatory research model to document abuse and propose remedies. We also provide direct legal services and support to people inside women's prisons and the family members of people inside women's prisons in California. So it's through this research and collaboration that we've begun to develop a comprehensive understanding of how prisons are a tool of reproductive oppression through their physical structure, their institutional regulations, and their impact on people. These all operate to destroy the ability of people to form families in ways that are desired, joyful, and without undue risk to their physical and mental health. For the last decade, Justice Now has been looking at how the prison system impacts reproductive justice. And our understanding of reproductive justice is the right that all people have, as well as all of the conditions that enable full self-determination over one's body, one's sexuality, one's sexual practices, one's gender, one's family. So our findings evidence a eugenic pattern of policy and practice with devastating impact on the health of communities of color in California, and with a particularly disparate impact on darker-skinned women of color inside of California women's prisons, as well as gender nonconforming people and transgender people. So to begin, many people have reported hysterectomies, that's the removal of a uterus, as well as oophorectomies, the removal of ovaries being pushed as a first response to problems such as uterine fibroids or ovarian cysts, when far less invasive remedies were available. For example, Hector, a black transgender man, received his first pap smear when he was in his early 20s and in prison. After discovering uterine fibroids, the prison doctor recommended that he get a hysterectomy. When the person asked if any other options might be available, the doctor merely looked at him and stated, "Well, you don't want to have kids, do you?" Hector's uterus was removed, and only afterwards did the prison medical staff ask him to sign a form indicating that he consented to the procedure. We also have received several reports of cases of coerced and forced sterilization in which people were asked to consent to sterilization due to an incorrect diagnosis while under sedation. We have documented that 2 women in prison had hysterectomies in response to cervical cancer that was later discovered to not exist. Similarly, in a separate case, a Latina in prison had the wrong ovary removed in response to an ovarian cyst. When she complained, the prison doctor implied that the removal of her ovaries did not matter because she was subject to a life sentence. Informed consent is grossly inadequate in prisons. Good doctor-patient communication is a prerequisite, as we all know, of informed consent, yet few people inside experience any relationship with a medical care provider or receive adequate information about their health and possible procedures. Extreme examples of such lack of communication were uncovered, including cases of people sterilized without any knowledge of the procedure being performed. For example, a 25-year-old black woman in prison had her ovaries removed in 2001, but the procedure and its effects were only explained to her in 2004 after she requested that a Justice Now attorney review her medical records to see why she had stopped menstruating and had symptoms that were later identified as associated with surgical menopause. Her case resulted in a lawsuit against the state that went to trial in 2009, and it was actually dismissed because it was over the statute of limitations. And for people who don't know what that means, it basically just means it's too late to hear your case. They're not going to consider it, no matter how important it is. People in California women's prisons also lose their ability to reproduce and form family due to abysmal and erratic reproductive and overall baseline health care, as well as the imposition of increasingly lengthy sentences, which effectively release many people, particularly people of color, from state custody only when they are no longer able to have biological children, or when they no longer have or are less likely to have the wherewithal to form family and raise the next generation. Let's see. Prison conditions during and immediately following pregnancy have displayed extreme violations of safe motherhood, including inappropriate diet and basic lack of care, which results in high high rates of stillbirth and miscarriage. Our research found that obvious warning signs of complications with pregnancy are regularly ignored. This includes extensive cramping and bleeding. One person's story goes as such: "It took prison staff an hour and a half of screaming before they transported me to the hospital. They don't rush, they never rush. She was told to shut the F up, you're not a baby, stop screaming. A nurse made another woman check her own vagina for amniotic fluid and then sent her to the hospital in her underwear, which her ambulance attendant said was ridiculous. Shackling still occurring during labor. There's a severe lack of mental health care, substandard postnatal care." These are just many of the ways that people's right to family is being destroyed and interrupted. So in July 2006, the Gender Responsive Strategies Commission of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation discussed, quote, "the cost effectiveness of sterilizing people in women's prisons shortly after birth." Shortly after our office, Justice Now confirmed that California began performing these sterilizations of women during labor and delivery at Valley State Prison for Women and California Institution for Women. The CDCR and federal receiver appointed by the federal courts to oversee healthcare provision in California prisons both endorse this program of sterilization in the coercive environment of prison. The CDCR has even redefined elective sterilization at birth and delivery of imprisoned pregnant people, primarily poor women of color, and I'm going to keep saying that because it's really important that we get that through our heads, as medically necessary so that it can be paid for by the state. And please note that if you have more than 2 teeth, then dentures aren't considered medically necessary. So it's really a question of what's actually necessary. When we complained about these policies, the state claimed that it was performing a valuable service to poor women whom otherwise could not afford this procedure. The state was acting as a benevolent caretaker. But what we know is that international, federal, and state law adopted in the last 20 years as a result of the activism of women of color and disabled people fighting eugenics practices prohibits elective sterilization, specifically in coercive environments and specifically in prisons. It is considered too risky to attempt to procure consent to sterilization in a coercive environment, an environment that's based on deprivation, punishment, control. For example, medical centers receiving federal funds are barred from sterilizing imprisoned people, period. Also, international genocide prohibitions preclude the state from promoting sterilization of particular populations. The current policy to sterilize imprisoned women during labor and delivery, regardless of consent, is a throwback of California's eugenic, ongoing, long-standing history legacy, and in violation of international and domestic law and medical practice. And we'd just like to wrap up by saying that common justifications pointing to the medical shortcuts or rogue medical staff, for instance, don't account for the many and parallel horrifying stories Justice Now has documented in California women's prisons. Instead, these stories indicate that this form of reproductive oppression stems from the inherent degradation in the prison environment and a complete denial of the humanity of people in prison and the communities people in prison come from, a denial of our right to live, to thrive, to have a future. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Kimberly Jeffrey. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Jeffrey, and I am here to talk openly and publicly about what I have experienced or how I have been personally affected by the many forms of aggressive, forced, or coerced sterilizations that still exist in our society, which are a direct violation of a person's human rights. I got connected to Justice Now in 2009 while serving a sentence at Valley State Prison in Chowchilla, California. Presently, I am working with Justice Now to help stop the Department of Corrections from destroying families and communities. I am really committed to this work because of my personal experiences with the criminal injustice system. It is historic that women of color, minorities, the poor, the homeless, alcoholics, criminals have been targets of forced sterilizations, and I am one of them. In 1996, I served my first prison term at Valley State Prison for Women. I was given 16 months for the crime of petty theft. I would go on to spend the next 13 years of my life in and out of the prison system. I guess I'm what you call a repeat offender. But what I remember being repetitive, what offenses I remember being repeated, was the demoralization, the degradation, the humiliation at the hands of the Criminal and Justice Department and its many industrial complexes. I was devalued as a human. No longer was my name Kimberly. I was to be referred to as a number, X17813, and you had to carry that number with you everywhere and present it when being asked by a guard. Being treated as if I were less than a human produced in me a despair, a mourning.
Go ahead. Continue. Let's continue.
Produced in me a despair, a mourning, as if I experienced a death, a loss, the loss of my dignity, my worthiness, my self-value. CDC, California Department of Corrections, these are the real repeat offenders who repeatedly offended me by denying me my right to dignity and humanity, repeatedly offended me by denying me the right to form and maintain a family, repeatedly offending me through oppression, exploitation, diminishing my ability to feel human. At Justice Now, we view prisons as a tool of reproductive oppression. I would like to share with all of you ways in which I have been personally affected. One example, while I was incarcerated in the San Francisco County Jail, I received a legal visit by a representative from the Department of Human Services Child Dependency Court, who tried to bring about an agreement claiming that if I would immediately receive a full hysterectomy, I could then be allowed to have my last baby back that was taken by Child Protective Services, and at that time was in foster care. I think another name for this is robbery. In 2009, I entered CDC in my 6th month of pregnancy. Due to having 2 prior cesareans, it was advised that a repeat C-section would be necessary. So a date was scheduled for this procedure to be performed. On the date that I was to deliver my child, moments before surgery, while under heavy sedation with both arms bound by straps, the surgeon casually, as if this thing was a regular procedure, casually verified to me the tubal ligation he will be performing on me immediately after delivery, and I panicked. I pleaded to him to understand me and hear me clearly that I at no point requested or desired this tubal ligation. So with clear hesitation in an unsuccessful attempt to persuade me otherwise, I was finally handed a medical form to sign, supposedly declining the tubal ligation immediately following delivery. I was told to put my signature on this paper, which I could not fully understand due to the incoherent state I was in as a result of the anesthesia. Being in such a state of mind, moments before labor, under heavy sedation, could I have possibly signed my name on what was actually a sterilization release? Did I not have the right to be fully informed before the procedure? Or what about my right to be aware of the potential risks of tubal ligation, which can range from nausea and vomiting to paralysis or even loss of life? Today, I do not know if this tubal ligation was performed or not. Soon after delivery, I was visited by a nurse who wanted to discuss birth control options with me. I politely asked if I could discuss this matter at a later date since I was trying to bond with my newly born baby. I wanted no distraction since I knew I had a very short time to be with my baby before returning to custody. She ignored my request and insisted I consent to sterilization. I felt pressure to choose an option and to choose an option at that immediate moment, and I was clearly being coerced to opt for the longer-lasting form of birth control, namely the IUD or Depo-Provera shot, in an attempt to further control my freedom to reproduce. I told the nurse I was concerned with side effects and I needed more time to research and explore more options to birth control. Her response was that there was no side effects and it was all totally safe. Even today within my community, I experience oppressive control by the state regarding my body, my family, and my choice to reproduce. The major goal of some welfare reformers is to reduce the number of children born to women receiving public assistance. One way that I have noticed is by making only long-lasting contraceptives available to women through Medi-Cal. I've tried in the past to get on birth control pills, but found out only the long-acting forms were available by prescription from the pharmacy, namely the IUD or the Depo-Provera. I am a participant in the CalWorks TANF welfare program. Yearly, you go up for review to determine continued eligibility. You're asked to sign numerous forms. One that particularly stood out to me is the MFG Maximum Family Grant Rule for recipients, which states that if you are on welfare, no longer will you receive aid or cash grants for any child born into your family. Reminds me of a saying I read, I guess if you can't feed them, you can't breed them. The former name is the Family Cap Law. Our suffering should be acknowledged, the truth should be established, and the responsible should be known. Prisons and the industrial complexes are tools of reproductive oppression. A prison that deprives people of basic sustenance, including adequate medical care, is incompatible with the concept of human dignity and has no place in civilized society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The two organizations which played a special role and are the major co-sponsors of this session. The first is the Haas Diversity Center, and its director is here. I wanted to give a special shout out to John Powell, who's standing up right there. The second organization is the Center for Genetics and Society, located here in Berkeley, and its associate director is our final presenter. That's Marcy Donofsky, who will raise the question about current concerns and should we worry about a new eugenics. Marcy.
Well, thanks, Troy, and thanks to everybody who's helped make this event possible. Let's see. David, could I get some help starting the PowerPoint? Thanks. And thanks especially to the law school, represented by David here, for all the help that we've been given. Yeah. So we've heard already about a variety of ways in which eugenics can manifest itself, and I'm going to focus on yet another one, and that's on the prospect of a new high-tech eugenics that would be based on human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies. I want to say to begin with that these technologies have many beneficial applications for medical purposes, to allow people to form new ways to form families, and just to understand more about human biology. But as has long been widely recognized, these technologies also pose various kinds of risks. And perhaps one of the most profound of these is that they could be used or misused in the service of a new eugenics. So I'm expecting that a number of people in this room will have seen the film Gattaca, shown there on the left. And raise your hands if you've seen Gattaca. Just curious, yeah. So as you remember then, the future, as it was portrayed in that film, was that everyone who can possibly afford it doesn't have children through sex. You have to rather go to a genetic technician to consult before you initiate a pregnancy and select your future child's traits, their intelligence, appearance, talents, and depending on how much you can afford, if your children are born with the high caliber selected traits, they are classified at birth as valids and become the ruling elite. And if you can't afford this, then your children are invalids, and they are going to wind up in menial jobs. They have no way out. They have no way up. Do we have to worry about this at all? Well, yeah, I'm sorry to say that we should be keeping track of these technologies and some of the people, and a small but disturbing number of people who think we should be using the technologies in the service of a new eugenics, and they think that would be a good thing. And the book that's shown on the right there is a book of people who take that position. Okay, so in the few minutes we have today, what I'm going to do is really try to quickly review the technologies that could wind up enabling such a high-tech eugenics, and give a few examples of the advocates who think this would be a good idea. So I'm going to start with a practice that's become common in the assisted reproduction industry, and that's to choose the appearance, the talents, the accomplishments of people who are providing gametes for other people's fertility treatments. So we call these people sperm donors and egg donors, even though we're talking about sales rather than donations, typically. Turns out Denmark is the world's leading exporter of sperm. Because many women and many couples around the world seem to want sperm providers who have Nordic looks. And that on the left is the Viking sperm donor. There's a major Danish sperm bank whose slogan is, "Congratulations, it's a Viking." Now, young women, as Troy mentioned, provide eggs for other people's fertility treatments and are recruited heavily to do this. And women that have high SAT scores, that have certain looks that are societally defined as beautiful, and who have athletic abilities or music abilities can be offered very large sums of money, not usually this high, but there's an ad for $100,000 for egg donors. Then to go on, the technologies that are sometimes collectively called selection technologies that really determine what kinds of babies are okay, are acceptable to be born, and which are not. And this is there's a variety of methods. Prenatal tests using ultrasound imaging and amniocentesis became widespread in the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, an embryo screening technique was introduced as a kind of an add-on to assisted reproduction. And these tests are promoted as ways to have healthy babies, as you see on the left there, a healthy future. And however, they also perform this gatekeeping function, and disability rights advocates have been very vocal, and were so very early on, in voicing concerns that this enables the selection of good genes and normal traits, and in so doing, hurts and devalues people who are living with the very disabilities that are often deselected. Nowadays, we're seeing embryo screening for more and more things. In 2009, an assisted reproduction clinic in Los Angeles posted on its website an offer to screen embryos so that parents could select a future child's hair color, eye color, and skin color. Now, this was, at the time at least, a scientifically dubious claim and certainly ethically fraught. And it prompted enough criticism that this fertility clinic had to withdraw the offer. They said they were doing that for now. And they continue to defend the practice. We're in store for a new set of selection, a new kind of selection technology that could really make these conversations much more widespread and pressing. And that's based on a new kind of prenatal test that can analyze the DNA of a fetus at a very, very early stage of a woman's pregnancy. We're talking 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. So this could, if this becomes widespread, then it became routinely used in pregnancies. You'd go to your first prenatal checkup. You're giving blood anyway. Some of that blood would be analyzed to produce perhaps a full genetic sequencing of your early stage fetus. This technique is already on the market for Down syndrome, and researchers are quickly developing it. So you will have, at that early stage of pregnancy, the kind of test results that you now get from companies like 23andMe and Eugenics. You have this kind of risk raised 25%, but this kind of risk lowered 24%, hundreds of conditions and traits, and it's going to really change what it means to be pregnant and reproduce. In an article in Nature titled "Get Ready for the Flood of Fetal Gene Screening," a Stanford bioethicist named Henry Greeley said that the specter of eugenics will loom over this whole discussion. And he went on to say that concerns about eugenics will increase as such testing moves from fatal diseases to less serious medical conditions and then on to non-medical characteristics. And I'll just note that those of us who are very strongly supportive of abortion rights and who are very strongly concerned about these kinds of selection practices have a big challenge ahead of us. Okay, moving on to more extreme technologies. Now here's something that has not been tried in human beings. The use of assisted reproduction techniques and genetic testing techniques to produce future generations that would be supposedly enhanced is kind of like a hydrogen bomb of human biotechnologies. Unfortunately, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a whole wave of explicit advocacy of this so-called inheritable genetic modification, including a public conference at UCLA that was attended by 1,000 people, covered on the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the scientists who organized the conference said they were aiming to get Americans to accept their vision of designer babies. And that book I showed you in the first slide, titled Engineering the Human Germline, was actually a report based on that conference. And the slide you see here on the left was from a Time magazine article that came out around then that was talking about what the media often called designer babies. Now again, this has not been tried in human beings, and we can't take claims about re-engineering future children at face value. The more we know about genes and the environment and how they interact, the more complex we understand that any kind of project like this would be. But it is important to note that we do have genetically modified animals with us in laboratories and farmyards around the world. And that little kitty on the right has had a jellyfish gene inserted into every cell in its body when it was an embryo. Okay, so just who are the people that are advocating this kind of stuff? Well, one of them, well, in general, many of them are not mainstream, are not marginal figures. Instead, they're mainstream scientists at prestigious institutions. And one of them, Daniel Koshland, was the editor for 10 years of Science magazine. He was a professor of biochemistry here at Berkeley, died in 2007. You might recognize his name because of the building named after him on campus. And at a symposium also here on campus, he was explicit in his writings and in his speaking about his advocacy, and said in this symposium I heard, we've created a society that's so technologically complex. Now we have to engineer people, create people basically who are smart enough to manage it. And then here's someone, a molecular biologist at Princeton, Lee Silver, who probably is the most revealing in terms of the social consequences of what this would mean. So in this book, he wrote that in this future where we adopt these technologies, the economy, the media, the entertainment industry, the knowledge industry will be controlled by members of the gen-rich class, and naturals will work as low-paid service providers or as laborers. I don't know if you saw the film Gattaca, but it sounds pretty familiar. Recently, we've been seeing a new wave of advocacy for high-tech eugenics from key researchers in this new field, scientific field called synthetic biology. Berkeley is playing a key role in the development of synthetic biology. And again, we're hearing this direct advocacy by some of the key figures. Oh, boy. Well, I thought it would be, I don't know what that extra I got in there. I don't know. I just want to say that underlying these kinds of advocacy are worldviews that we need to take into account, and things like, the acceptance as inevitable of vast amounts of inequality, and the acceptance of extreme uses of the technology, indeed the celebration of it, and the claim that these things are inevitable, that there's nothing we can do about them. And that we should focus on enhancing individuals because that's much more exciting than improving society and changing social conditions, economic conditions for people. And there's also, I think, a refrain in these new advocates of a new eugenics that we should let the market decide. And we don't need public policy. And some of them think we don't even need public discussion, that these are things that the scientists should decide and the market should then take over. And I just want to argue back that we think that we can extend this conversation widely, explain the social consequences of it, and we are working to develop a new biopolitics is the term that we're using to describe an approach to these technologies that are based in the set of values you see on the screen there, social justice and public interest values. And we'd welcome the opportunity to talk to any of you who might be interested in finding out more. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, we knew we had time constraints, and so we tried to put in place a mechanism whereby we'd have maybe these cards to distill a particular common theme among you. We'll try that, and Sue was going to give me a summary distillation. You've got them there? Okay, all right. So while we're doing that, let me acknowledge others in the audience who've been playing a central role. The director of the Center for Genetics and Society is sitting here, Rich Hayes. Could you just, thank you very much. And another important co-sponsor was the American Culture Center, and its head is sitting there, Victoria Robinson. Great. Yeah, just raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, so, Sue, do you have the winner? This is from the office of the State Senator Lonnie Hancock. Comment: I want to thank Justice Now for their leadership in this issue. As chair of the Senate Public Safety Committee, Senator Hancock looks forward to continuing work on this issue. Lonnie Hancock was going to join us today, but there's a session currently in Sacramento where she could not be here. But there shall also possibly be there for some legislative initiatives around this issue. Let's hope. Thank you. Were deaf people also routinely sterilized as disabled? Anyone on the panel know the answer? Yeah.
Yes, they were, although that was not one of the paramount distinctions in California. That was not one of the paramount classifications used in California, although there's, with deaf individuals, often the policy tended more to be long-term segregation rather than sterilization. And in talking about prison systems, there's obviously a real parallel between the eugenic aim of long-term sterilization of people, supposedly dysgenic people. We haven't talked much about that, and long-term incarceration. So that's another parallel we could delve into.
So I don't know the outcome of a challenge that was held not in the United States, but in 2008, the UK passed the Human Fertilization and Embryology Bill, and there was a challenge brought because it was declared that you could not implant a deaf embryo even if both parents who were using the PGD were deaf. So that is an ongoing issue in the UK.
Next question was, what is eugenics? I'll take a quick stab. Eugenics historically had two different components. One was called negative eugenics, which meant that you wanted to reduce the population of people who were thought to be unfit. That included anyone who was mentally unstable or mentally, quote, defective. At the turn of the century, we had concepts like moron, idiot, and people who were in for certain kinds of criminal violations, the quote, unfit. That was negative eugenics. But there was also a development called positive eugenics, where you wanted to, quote, make good babies. And that's, at its extreme, it was called the Lebensborn Project of the Germans during the Nazi era. And the Lebensborn Project produced thousands and thousands of babies from SS officers and women in Germany who agreed for the purposes of the state's increased racial supremacy to come forward and make babies. Some of you will be shocked to know that one of the persons who came out of that situation was one of the lead singers from ABBA. You want to respond to that?
Well, just in the United States, one of the versions of positive eugenics was better baby contests or fitter family contests, which happened at state fairs often in California and around the country.
What is the right, you want someone else? What is the right wing saying about sterilization in light of its opposition to abortion? Anyone?
I can answer that as far as it's coming also with the fact that the pro-life movement is not monolithic. Speaking as I guess a person who's in that movement because of concerns about eugenics, it includes, of course, the right-wing people who make the front page, but it also includes
the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic, but most of them are opposed to sterilization on moral grounds and its grounds. But there's been a strong friendship to the disability rights movement on the part of the Right to Life movement. And while I don't know about the political right, but I know that the mainstream Right to Life movement, when Jocelyn Elders made her remarks about how she was glad because that there were not very many Down syndrome babies being born, the pro-life movement, that energized them because that was eugenics. And I think the mainstream pro-life movement, if you look up Ethics in Medicine, that magazine, you'll find a lot of arguments, and they are very, very strongly opposed to this trend. In fact, Nigel Cameron, who is an outspoken critic of eugenics and the new biology, and a friend of and a person who's willing to work across ideological lines with people in the environmental movement, was a few years back the keynote speaker at National Right to Life. So as one who's been involved in the pro-life movement for some 25 years, I think I can answer that there's pretty widespread opposition to it.
Okay, thank you. We're trying to get in the last couple of questions. There's a hand in the back. You want to respond to this? Okay. What is your opinion of Planned Parenthood's founding members' relationship with the American Eugenics Society? That's a question for either of you, I suppose. I think it's on.
Okay, so, it's true that eugenics in the 20th century was a movement that spanned across the political spectrum. There were people from what we would now consider themselves at the time to be very progressive and very liberal. And there were people in the middle of the road, and there were people way on the right in terms of being openly racist and wanting to eliminate certain populations. And so this legacy is something that it cuts across the usual kinds of polarizations in ways that we have to really grapple with, and we have to really understand it. And having worked with people from Planned Parenthood over the last decade, I can say that a lot of people in that organization are doing that and have done that and are doing that. And a lot of people in the reproductive rights and especially the reproductive justice movement are really looking carefully at how we can move past that legacy and make sure that we don't go down any of the roads that would lead to sterilization abuse, that would lead to a new high-tech eugenics again.
Thanks. Just as a footnote on that, it was never a left and right distinction in this country in the early part of the 20th century on eugenics. Some of the, quote, and this is in quotes, best minds in the country, liberal, progressive even, the progressive movement was tied up with eugenics. It was progressive to be in favor of hygiene and eugenics. The two were linked by people who thought of progress as being getting rid of the infirm, the bad babies. President Stanford University, professors of psychology at Harvard, governors all over the country. The left wing would be George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells. I can name a number of different people who were, quote, progressive, who were in favor of eugenics and very much involved in that movement. So our current notion that the right is more eugenically inclined than the left may be true, but historically that distinction does not hold. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to again thank all of our sponsors and our presenters for their contributions. Thank you.